Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast is Wesley Wildman. That's right, Boston University professor of philosophy, theology, ethics. That's all combined. He is a study fanatic of the Biocultural Study of Religion. And he is on the podcast to give us a preparatory engagement for the God Debacle, October 21st, 2015. So buckle your theological safety belt, because this junk's about to get divine. Maybe, if there's a divine or ultimate reality at all, that demands a debacle, not a debate and not a conversation. And that's happening October 21st with Philip Clayton and LeRon Shults. And you just go to this post on Homebrewed Christianity, or just type in the God Debacle, or check the Twitter hashtag God Debacle, and you'll find out information. Click around. You'll be able to sign up for the free video stream. If you're in Southern California, you can sign up and get a ticket to come do it live and in person here in Redondo Beach. And there's a happy hour before it if you are here. And you find out in this in this podcast that Wesley Wildman says the Science and Religion people at Boston University, they're getting together to enjoy the live stream. So if you're putting together a little live stream action somewhere in the country, email me and let me know. I will gladly post information on the website so people could get together and talk about it in person. And if you host a soiree, for the God Debacle, and you have 10 people there, send me a picture of y'all, with the God Debacle in the background, and I will mail you a free book. Maybe LeRon's The Birth of God, or Phil's The Predicament of Belief, or maybe my new book on Jesus, or probably not, but that was just a way I could bring it up in case you happen to listen to this podcast and have not listened to me tell you that you can pre-order it right now on Amazon. But the best way to do it is go to homebrewedguides.com, and you can pre-order 100 copies. Or you can pre-order the entire Homebrewed Christianity set right there, the cheapest price, with freebies, perks, and free shipping. And that's just because I love you and or want to sell the book. But they aren't mutually exclusive. I don't want to either or. My desire for success as a series editor and author, with my sheer love for anyone that listens and makes it possible for me to nerd out with my geek out on the internet with people as cool as you. That's right, deacons. Anyway, Wesley Wildman was tons of fun. He is friends with LeRon and with Phil. And you find out not only does he understand both of them really well, and he sees some places of contact and of difference, he also, in this conversation, talks about his own way of connecting religion, spirituality, and science as a minister. He's from Australia, you'll tell by the accent, and as a scholar. So just know this is an intense, nerdy thing. And then when it ends, we kept talking for a little bit about his research grant, and I pitch him a proposal of the world's greatest iPad app. So there'll be like a second or two of music. Then it comes back on, and you can hear this. The only thing is you won't see the video part to see just how feverishly Wesley was taking notes about this brilliant idea, and or rolling his eyes and chuckling. I can't tell you which one, but I'm sure he took it as seriously as it needed to be taken. Anyway, before we jump into the God Debacle preview, which right now you're telling your phone, you're like, hey, Siri, remind me to register for the free live stream of the God Debacle, bring 10 friends to my house, take a picture of it, and get some free books, especially because LeRon and Phil's books are both hardback and like $50, $80. I'm going to get it for free for having my friends come over and talk about God. And by talk, I do not mean converse or debate. I mean debacling. That's right. Anyway, before we jump in, just know, if you are in Oklahoma, I'm coming this 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of November. Going to be in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa. Going to hang out, talk about Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Just Freaking Awesome. The editor cut out the just freaking part, but I it's still there in my heart, right next to Jesus. Anyway, yeah, it's coming out. I'm going to be in Oklahoma. Then going to be at Subvert the Norm the 4th of November in Springfield. I'm doing a one-day event with Jack Caputo And Pete's texting me saying he's going to come. He's like, Trip, can I get a discount to you and Caputo's day-long activity? I'm like, no, Pete. No, you are famous and you have tons of money. I know this because we had to live together, and that's what rich people do, is they live in the same house together. And I'm like, you're going to have to work for your supper. That's right, Pete. You're going to have to join us if you plan on coming. And because he always takes my parental tone and does exactly what I say, and he'll tell you this. That's very true, very true. You can find out more. Just listen to the International Podcast Day podcast, where we set a single-day download record for Homebrewed and biggest download ever for the month. Just listen to it. You'll find out just how seriously he takes me. About as serious as Wesley took my iPad app suggestion at the end of this episode. Anyway, so then Subvert the Norm. There's going to be a live podcast. I'll say some things. Tons of other people are going to be there. Catherine Keller's going to be there. Just Catherine JC. And then I'm going to Arkansas. So if you're in Fayetteville, Arkansas, I want to see you that Sunday. I'm preaching 3 times at the church I'm going to. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And the third time is going to be great. So you can sleep in, you go to the third service, and you'll see the polished version. Actually, I've probably worked on the sermon more than the rest of it because I haven't preached in so long. I'm rip-roaring, ready to go. All right. It's homebrewedchristianity.com, at Trip Fuller on the Twitter. We have a Facebook page. Homebrewed loves you. We want to give you ingredients so you can brew your own faith. We don't want to think for you. We want to think with you. And we want to think with you even in the case of intense debacles, like October 21st with Philip Clayton. Wesley Wildman is going to introduce Phil v. LeRon. Here it goes. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Ooh. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today, all the way on the East Coast, I'm talking to Wesley Wildman. If you have Googled a theologian and wanted an accurate summary, then you've probably found his rather wild and wacky Wesley Wildman Theologians page. If you go to the American Academy of Religion and you care about science and religion, you always show up when Wesley and Philip Clayton get to argue together. If you are wondering what it's like to hear someone talk who is a rather genius in multiple fields and attempts to connect dots that most of us would run from, then it's your lucky day, because Wesley's here and he's going to help us understand just what in the world is going to be going on at the great God Debacle, which is neither a conversation nor a debate. It's a debacle, and which is essential, because everyone knows that debacles are neither conversations nor debates. All right, Wesley, thank you for joining the podcast. How are you doing today in Boston?
Doing great in Boston. It's cold here, but I'm very glad to be chatting with you, Trip. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm very excited to have you on, and I know we're going to be talking about God and philosophy and science, but I just mentioned to you before we started recording that one of the first books I read in undergrad that made me realize just how useful, clear, distinct ideas are, engaging topics, was your Christology book. What was the title? Like Plausibility of Christology or something like that?
Fidelity with Plausibility.
There you go. Yeah. So tell us where you're teaching and how you got there vocationally.
I'm at Boston University. My main location is in the School of Theology there, and I'm cross-appointed to the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I'm involved in teaching philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, systematic theology, religion and science, and the scientific study of religion. There's a great group of students around us. I'm spending most of my time with doctoral students, and I never teach undergraduates particularly. So I find these people in this environment keep me fresh and alive. I also helped to found a few years ago a nonprofit called the Institute for the Biocultural Study of Religion. It's a think tank, and we do the scientific study of religion there. And we've been going great. There's dozens of people involved, and there's money coming in from grants, and we're able to support students and other budding professionals like postdocs. So my life's taken up with the scientific study of religion, particularly intensively in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you end up a scientific study of religion and teaching at a theology school? Not always immediately obvious how those two are connected in, especially American Christianity. Can you kind of share how your own connection to the church and faith and how that type of inquiry became something you would dedicate time and write grant proposals? Anyone that writes a grant proposal really does care about the topic. They're not easy to write.
Yeah. I grew up in Australia, as the accent betrays, and my early life was all about music and mathematics and science and church. There was no humanities, there was no philosophy, there were no library books, there was nothing. So I was very strong in the sort of music, science, religion axis, and very weak on the humanities side. As time went on and I started doing graduate work, I realized there was a whole other world out there. And the possibility of theology and philosophy and religious studies opened up to me, and I became really excited about it. So I switched from a probable career in mathematics and the sciences to a career in philosophical theology and philosophy of religion. But of course, I brought the science with me the whole time. Came to the Graduate Theological Union and studied with Claude Welch there. Mm-hmm. Just retired as president and dean of the GTU. He was 65 when I arrived. Developed a wonderful friendship with him. Spent years teaching on the UC Berkeley campus with Houston Smith, and worked pretty closely with the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences with people like Bob Russell and Ted Peters. So I kept the science side and the philosophy side and the religious studies side all together throughout my training. I had a quick sabbatical replacement position at Stanford, and then I picked up the job at Boston University. So I went there in 1993 and have been given freedom to teach on all of those fronts the whole time I've been there, mm-hmm. which is a wonderful thing. So I do teach seminary students, some of whom want to become ministers. And, of course, I teach PhD students who want to become professors and other people who want to make a difference in the world in some other way. Mm-hmm. I am myself an ordained clergy person in the Uniting Church of Australia, and I've served churches for 7 years full time, both in Sydney and in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. Excuse me. So I bring that awareness of real life church institutions and whatnot with me. My theological outlook hasn't really changed since I was a late teen, except that I learned what the tracings of it are through the long reaches of history and also across religious and cultural traditions. So I've become more articulate in explaining what my fundamental theological instincts are, but they are rooted in a kind of being raised as a pietist Methodist, which wasn't strong on doctrine and was pretty strong on experience. So mm-hmm. That's my background. That's how I got here.
So thinking about helping people understand just what is involved in tracing those type of ideas through these different disciplines and the kind of questions and things that pop out when LeRon and Phil debacle about things. Can you kind of share, like, what was that understanding of God that you had growing up, Wesleyan piety, and what were kind of the initial questions that provoked or at least compelled you to keep that tracing path going on? Like what provoked wanting to understand more deeply what's going on in God?
Well, I do theology without walls. So the institutional home isn't a church tradition. It's the secular academy. It's the modern university. But I can relate my viewpoint to specific traditions, including the one I was raised in, which is Christianity. The touchstones for sort of getting at my central viewpoint would be figures like Paul Tillich and the mystical theologians and philosophers of the Christian tradition, all of whom say that God is beyond being and not being. So the categories of existence and non-existence, for example, couldn't be applied to God. It's a kind of category mistake to say that God exists or doesn't exist, because God is being itself, or the ground of being. So that's my home turf. I have a particularly mystical, philosophical version of that. Mm-hmm. But that'd be a quick sketch of my home territory.
So what about the when people use the phrase like ground of being, or there's the difference between finite things that have existence with beginning and endings is, different ontologically than the infinite or something like that. What do you think, or what are the ways that gets heard really incorrectly by people of faith, and what is it that as a scholar you're trying to be precise about? Because nothing freaks someone out to begin a sermon like, "I'm so glad to be here this morning. I would like for you to know God does not exist. God is eternal," or "God insists," or "God is infinite." Like, we have all these little phrases we'd like to do, but what's being gained by denying existence to God and philosophically?
Yeah, you don't deny existence to God. You deny both existence and non-existence. On the grounds that it's a category mistake. So what's being gained is iconoclastic leverage against anthropomorphism. In other words, anthropomorphism is the tendency we all have to picture God in the image of human beings. And the iconoclastic response to that is to smash the idols. It's to say the idols we create using our anthropomorphic human shaping instincts lead us astray. They give us poor images. They're images that we can use. They're images that will help us engage divine reality, but they're pretty distorted, and we do well to be aware of it and push back. So that's the main practical leverage you get. When you see in the Hebrew Bible God speaking out of the whirlwind at the end of the book of Job, you have that impulse expressed in a kind of narrative way, with God demanding to know why on earth Job would think that he would have some kind of rational insight into the character of God. And in the same way, I think we all do well to embrace a certain amount of humility, even if you're quite rationalistic in your theology, when it comes to speaking about something that probably surpasses complete cognitive grasp of any possible being. So that's the big payoff, and I think it's spiritually really relevant to a lot of different kinds of people. The downside of it is similarly spiritual in dimension. People like the idea of a God who knows the number of hairs on their head, who's got a plan for their lives, who gives them meaning, who guarantees them a future after death, and so forth. And all of these issues become harder to assert with confidence in the framework that I think is more correct for doing theology. So it stresses people out of their comfort zones, their personal theism, their personal God relationship. It stresses that without attacking it. It just stresses it by asking people to think in more than one way at the same time. Does that help?
Yeah. No, I think it's important. And, it's funny, like, I had an encounter once with a congregant who was very disappointed about intentionality of gender-inclusive language in worship. And I said, well, if you only really use one type of language, people might confuse the particular language, namely masculine and anthropomorphic, with the way God really is. And he said, well, we all know God's spirit, so I don't know what the big deal is of saying he's a he. And and I was like, so are you upset for just cultural reasons? Like, you're aware that it's problematic, you just don't want to do different? And he goes, no, I don't. I when I'm praying, do you really think I want to sit around thinking I'm praying to something I don't know anything about?
Right.
And and he goes on. It just tells these stories, and I think that impulse, even if it is kind of an embarrassing one to put that way, is something that especially once you start to investigate kind of the origins of religion, its role in communities, and things like that. It's not surprising that human beings desire to have a personal understanding of ultimate reality.
Yeah, sure. It's a fine line for all of us. We're people as human beings, so we're going to have personal relationships with things. Heck, with our computers, we have personal relationships, even though it's an inanimate object. And the same's true for our relationship with gods or saints or whatever our particular religious tradition, bodhisattvas or jinns or angels or demons, wherever we happen to be, they're going to be personal relationships because of the kinds of creatures we are. So we have to accept that about ourselves, and that's going to be the mode of our engagement very often. But at the same time, we need not to be deceived by our emotional needs and our cognitive tendencies. We need to be able to get critical distance. Now, you can't prove that those ideas are wrong just because someone's got cognitive and emotional tendencies to appreciate them. What you can do, though, is be made alert be made wary. And so pay attention to your language and to the way you form ideas using your own preconceived preferences.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I find interesting is like people listening, they're going, "Oh, this is a very nuanced understanding of God. It's clearly informed by his engagement with science and philosophy, awareness of the diversity of understandings of ultimate reality across the globe, and yet, if you were just turn on news, science channels, things like that, this is never going to happen when discussing the reality of God, right? Like it tends to be the popular framework for discussing God is either like bearded man with trident, or the world is a reductionistic, deterministic, mechanistic world completely explained, and all religious phenomena is explained away, not just accounted for scientifically. So how, like thinking about it, like how has, what are some healthy ways of beginning a conversation about God that actually mean dialogue could happen afterwards, rather than just rhetorical flourishes that function more like a World Wrestling Federation type title match?
If you happen to be Jewish, do you have Jewish listeners particularly? Do you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you happen to be Jewish, the post-Holocaust reflection on the nature of God is a visceral issue for people. And that the idea that God could be a human-like agent with the power to intervene but let this happen anyway is almost completely intolerable to a lot of different Jewish people. So there's this internal pressure to find a solution, a more adequate conception of God that's realistic about the horrible things that happen here on planet Earth, as well as the joyous and the wonderful things. And so that pressure is in people's lives. They really feel it. And they very often rest content with superficial answers. That's fine up to a point, but there has to be a space for people who are more interested in thinking clearly about things to find deeper answers, better answers, answers that are more connected to the religious traditions that bring wisdom into the current. So I'm not giving up on the possibility of public dialogue that's just a little bit more subtle, a little bit more integrative, a little bit more balanced, and still thoroughly iconoclastic, and still thoroughly about the importance of spiritual engagement with ultimate reality. I'm going to keep trying.
So, when you like take off your role as a minister and start to and put on your philosopher of science hat, and if you're sitting across from your kind of confessional doxological language about your spiritual experiences that are clearly mediated through the Christian tradition, how do you give an account of what's going on in something like prayer that is like what do you say is happening? Like, how do you give an account for it? Because I feel like that's one of the places that you see lots of people even affirming it as functioning, right? Like even Sam Harris thinks contemplative prayer does things, right? So, and it's one of those places across religious traditions. There's evidence of it, at least within our bodies, having similar effects and stuff like that.
Yeah. Look, a lot of spiritual practices are efficacious. They get things done. They get things done in us. You can divide the question between, is there a divine agent who hears prayers and answers them, such that we could pray for someone remotely, a long distance away, who doesn't even know who we are, and that would make a difference? The evidence, the research studies on that are very discouraging. If you want divine influence of that kind, that stuff doesn't appear to happen insofar as you can trace it in research studies. But personal prayer, meditation, bodily postural meditation, all kinds of things like that, they do have effects, health effects. They have spiritual orientation effects. They have moral effects. And they have spiritual effects in the sense that people feel more deeply connected to their whatever their ultimate reality is, whatever their ultimate concern is. I conceive of prayer, even public prayer, in that latter sense. So, of course, obviously, from what I said before, I'm not thinking of God as a supernatural agent up there who hears prayers and answers them. But I am thinking of God as the depth structures of nature and the dynamics of nature itself. And we engage when we concentrate, when we pray, when we act, when we talk with each other and so forth. Changes us, changes our bodies, and it can change the people in our immediate vicinity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it, I think.
So, how would you describe someone looking at this and going, all right, Wesley, look, this sounds to me like recognizing if you just discovered that in this city you've never been to before, that all the soccer players live longer, and you're like, a religion's like the sport soccer, and then in this town over that they've never encountered, all the basketball players live longer, and in there they're like, if you want to live a long life, you got to go with the basketball players, but really they just all do cardiovascular exercise, have a personal trainer, and eat vegetables. Right. And the rest of the culture plays the video games of basketball and soccer, but they aren't actually doing these practices that just have demonstrable effects on your life, which are unrelated to any of the referent. You don't need a God to have that work. So, how do you see God's relationship to that? Like, basketball's relationship to cardiovascular exercise? Is there any necessity to it?
I don't think God is doing anything. I don't think God is an agent, to put it in the bluntest possible way. What's doing things are agents in the world, like people, animals, and there's natural processes, and sometimes law-governed and sometimes quite crazy, chaotic. And this is what life is. So where do you find God? In the depth dimension of this life. Mm-hmm. Depth dimension, not as an agent who's somehow outside the story doing stuff, but in the depths and wonders and intensity of this life. So we're encountering God in those moments of intensity where life becomes translucent and suddenly we can see how deep it is. Whereas normally the way we live, we don't see those depths. So people will complain that this is just atheism. It's no different than atheism.
Oh, I know. This is what LeRon's telling me already. I can hear him in the back of my right there.
And he will tell me that as well. And of course, at one level, of course, it is atheistic because I'm rejecting the idea of God as an agent, a being who is an agent. So I'll concede that. But the thing is, if we stop using God language to describe the depths of reality, we lose touch with one of the deepest and most important aspects of human life and life itself. I'm not willing to give that up. I want to fight for the use of the word God in relation to the depths of reality. And that's where I expect to find God, not as an agent doing stuff, but in the depths. And I want to keep alive a conversation that helps other people see that as well.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe the origins of religion in the kind of social evolution of humanity?
It's a very complicated question. We tracked the literature on this, and of course we founded the journal Religion, Brain and Behavior, which spends a long time thinking about this in the institute that I co-founded. So I can't give a simple answer to that question, but I can give you a couple of trajectories. One is social and the other is cognitive, and they are tightly connected. Mm-hmm. The social trajectory is that human beings are a social species, like ants or whales. We're into this bonding together thing. And as groups, we're more efficient, we're more flexible and adaptable when we've got the ability to bond with each other. Religion helps us bond. And then cognitively, we've got certain problems to solve in this world if we're going to survive. And that gives us a basic cognitive emotional apparatus. That's where we got it from. And that cognitive apparatus has areas where it works really, really well, and under stress, areas where it doesn't work very well at all. We see that with visual illusions, right? Our visual system works really well under some conditions, but with some kinds of stimuli, we start seeing weird stuff happening. That's amusing, but in real life, it's way beyond just visual illusions. It's our whole cognitive emotional apparatus sometimes misfires. So we're dealing with bodies and with a big, long history of our species that can lead us towards religion with a serious question mark as to how authentic or reliable the religious beliefs and experiences would be. I think putting our heads in the sand and pretending that issue isn't a real issue is just a mistake. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting about Philip Clayton and LeRon Shults is that they both know what's going on in that research, but they have different interpretations of it. LeRon saying it means that religion is essentially deeply mistaken, and Phil insisting that you've got a philosophical question after you've finished working through all the science, you still have to answer the philosophical question, and there are philosophical reasons to still accept that God is at least minimally intentional, agential, and aware, even though you know about all of that stuff, about human cognitive and emotional tendencies. So religion evolves in this very complicated dialogue between our nature as a social species and the cognitive emotional makeup that we have as a species. It comes out of there. Telling the whole story in detail is complicated and difficult, but it's something like that. Mm-hmm. And the result for us right now is a very serious question that's at stake in the Great God Debacle.
So one of the things that both Phil and LeRon spend quite a bit of time dealing with, and I think this is because the scientific evidence kind of makes you really have to talk about it, is the hyperactive agency detection device. And both of them, when they've been on the podcast, have made comments about it, and in their books they talk more about it. And if you just start to think of the ability to procreate more, if you dodge every possible tiger in the rustling versus just ones you've determined are actual tigers, then there's that kind of selection for agency in things. And if you like, the moment that becomes something that's kind of identifying supernatural agents, then there's this evolutionary story of the concept of God. And you can see it in the Hebrew scriptures, in the New Testament. It's even different understanding of God than in all of the Hebrew scriptures. Like, how do you, as a philosopher of science, take these different data points and then look at the transformations of the idea of God in Scripture? I mean, it's something Tillich spent quite a bit of time about as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle. The evidence for the hyperactive agency detection device is a little weaker than I think people have been saying. But there are several dozen different cognitive emotional tendencies, and the same story gets to be told about all of them. And what story is that? We have a tendency to interpret the world in particular ways, even when we're lacking evidence to support our interpretation. So we're going to say that there's a pattern that we just saw in these events. There must be a God who intended the pattern. We see the pattern. We invoke God as the cause for the pattern, or an ancestor, or a bodhisattva, or, there are plenty of non-theists. This happens in all religions, not just theistic religions. In fact, it happens with all people, even non-religious people. So we're constantly in this sort of stretching our minds outwards to interpret an ambiguous world. The interpretations are inflected by these powerful experiences we have. And those experiences are so convincing that they seem more convincing, more real to us than ordinary. Like if you were ask someone who thinks God loves them and they went through this transition in their life where they just felt so absolutely loved and accepted. It's one of those pillar-like moments. It's so clear and so vivid that it can't be shaken. It's more real than the experience of the ordinary world. But evaluating it philosophically is a different issue. So you can see in traditions like the biblical tradition, people trying to learn how to evaluate the ideas of God that they instinctively come up with. So as they get better at that, you see those ideas shifting. So there's quite a lot of transformation in the Hebrew Bible, from the earlier parts that you see in some of the Pentateuch and some of the prophets, some of the Psalms, through the later stuff that you see in Genesis, for example, which is compiled quite late based on older sources. In that process, you see God changing from a local deity who's concerned with this particular tribe and clearly wants to fight with other deities to establish supremacy, to a God who creates the whole universe and has no peers whatsoever. That's a massive transformation. And it's a transformation that happens as people concentrate on their experiences and the interpretations they instinctively make and contest against that a little bit with thoughtful philosophical reasoning.
So one of the passages that's always kind of blown my mind, because, like even that statement, something ministers rarely bring up at church, right? Like you don't begin like, in our Hebrew scripture reading lessons today, this is kind of a period of henotheism in the ancient Near East. But that's not what's there. One of the passages that kind of always blows my mind of staying in scripture, Psalm 82, where God kind of looks at all the other deities in the divine council, who's technically in charge of other tribes, and gets pissed that justice isn't going there and kills them all. Now, I mean, it's a certain stage of moral development where the answer to poor performance at your job is just genocide of all the people doing it. But the psalmist is not worried about the character of God in this, of slaughtering deities, since God can take out everyone on the planet except for a family in a boat. So, but in it, it's on behalf of justice, right? God just eliminates all these other deities, but the issue is justice. So, like, how, as someone who's aware of religion functioning for the community in relationship to other communities, and it being in some sense like selected for or performing better because it holds communities together and creates more generative relationships with other communities, would you start to understand this shift in our understanding of ultimate reality to one where from multiple to your own to a singular deity to one that has combative relationships externally to one that values those, and this turn to what is it that God wants is actually about the relations of the people versus the people's relationship to the transcendent.
Yeah, it's a long and complicated history, isn't it? I love that history because it shows human beings grappling with their best ideas about God. Karen Armstrong traces their history. So does some other people. God really does have a history, I think, the idea of God. And that's just the Jewish and Hebrew history. There are other histories and other traditions that are equally mutable. Mm-hmm. Something happened in the Axial Age, this period between like 800 and 200 BCE. Something happened where the civilizations were getting really large and there was pressure to produce a conception of God which was so large and so rooted in the cosmological realities and environment of people's lives that it was no question that there was just one God and this God was everyone's God. It was the key to uniting massive groups of people across cultural differences, people who were total strangers. Now, this is part of the dialectic I'm describing. You get this back and forth between social realities, political realities and so forth on the one hand, and people's best ideas about God, their symbolic engagements, the way they do their rituals and their prayers and so forth on the other hand. It's a living system of mutual dialogue backwards and forwards, and it produces change. And people who say there's no change are just not paying attention. There really is change. And we've got another moment right now of change of exactly that kind as the scientific study of religion draws our attention to the cognitive and emotional capacities and tendencies of people and asks the question, can we contest those capacities or do we need to? And can we get philosophical reasoning established about the nature of God independently of those questions, but taking account of them? So we're right in the middle of it.
So how do you see the growing awareness of more and more people of religious pluralism impacting the same kind of moment of transformation and things like because oftentimes you know as much about your neighbor's religion as your own, right? Like that's what you discover if you're teaching a seminary class, is that someone felt called to actually serve a congregation, will go in debt to do it, and they haven't read but 3 books of the Bible already. And so there's a sense that there's like this surface level awareness of religions and spirituality in general, but our rootedness and depth in our own tradition is often neglected in congregations and in education and that kind of stuff. But it's not like you can avoid living in a world where there's like these multiple spheres of meaning coming from these traditions that were on their own for so long and now they're colliding.
Yeah, one of the projects in the institute I described before is called the Modeling Religion Project, and we try and build computer models and simulations of various aspects of religious cognition and culture. And one of the things we've discovered as we think about the modern period is precisely on this question of transformation, of pluralism and so forth. So what we think we've discovered is that people lose confidence in supernaturalist ideas when under certain conditions. When there's a lot of pluralism is one of the key factors, because it relativizes your attachment to your own idea as you become aware of how important and powerful other people's similar ideas are to them. And education, which takes away the need to invoke God, and as does the alleviation of deprivation conditions. Mm-hmm. You don't need God to help you solve problems. It's better to go to the supermarket and just buy your food.
So the religious right in working against Obamacare was really standing up for apologetic success conditions.
I think you're right. The freedom issue is important too, because there's you have to take away the social penalties for sort of voting with your feet, for following your conscience. And when all those four conditions are in place, there is a movement towards, not against religion, not against spirituality anyway, but against supernaturalism. Mm-hmm. So you get post-supernatural forms of spirituality. And by our estimates, about 27% of people at the moment in the United States are basically in that mold, and it's been growing pretty quickly. And within about 50 years, it's headed to go past 50%. And that group is likely to be the majority group, unless those conditions fail. And you just gave a nice example of trying to increase deprivation conditions by resisting the Affordable Care Act. And in that process, of course, you're removing the conditions that lead to a post-supernaturalist form of religion and spirituality. It's fascinating to see it happening. So we're describing a two-way process of change. You can go in either direction depending on which factors are in place. So if you want to stop it from happening, you know how. You have to interfere with freedom, interfere with pluralism, reinstantiate deprivation conditions, and hobble education. If you can do any one of those four things, you will drive the system back towards supernaturalist religions. But if you can't affect any of them, and all four of them remain strong, then you drive towards post-supernaturalist religious traditions and spirituality.
Yeah, I guess the difficulty is to gather that scientifically would require more supernaturalists to read journals that are just methodologically problematic, right? Like you would have to engage in science, think it works before that. But, there's a certain pragmatism to conservative religious people where, they don't care why it works if it works.
That's right. And the nice thing about this research is that it outlines strategies for both parties, for the people who don't like this change and for the people who do. You know exactly what you need to do to stop it or speed it up. So it's sort of open. It's the open access research approach. It doesn't advocate for a particular outcome. It describes a causal system that you can manipulate by turning dials,
What about the cultivation of persecuted identity? I mean, even with the Kim Davis thing, you're sitting there going, man, y'all have not left United States. This is just, if you think you're persecuted, then Jesus has confused you.
Yeah, look, these are wonderfully in-group phenomena. Mostly, our clannishness and our tribalism as a species is really reinforced by religion. So in certain communities, you've got a lot of in-group nurturing activities that are really pretty wonderful if you're on the inside. They're not a lot of fun if you're marginalized, but if you're on the inside, they're wonderful. Every now and again, one of those activities, say standing up for the right fearlessly, right? One of those things gets exposed to a much wider audience. And that's what happened with the Kim Davis situation. This is it's not unusual behavior for her. I'm sure she's always held that view, but when it comes out into the public, everyone is suddenly aware of how very specific and intricate the worldview is. Mm-hmm. They see it, and it's quite shocking to most people, and of course appalling that someone would accept an elected office and then not do the charged task. Appalling, as if it could be a matter of conscience. It should be a matter of salary, But anyway, it's a fascinating situation.
Yeah. So when you're sitting with people from different religious traditions, and then with atheists, but you're trying to describe what you can and can't say, or what the evidence permits you to say about what is behind religious phenomena, how would you describe the spectrum of plausible answers? Right, like if like you mentioned earlier, like LeRon and Phil aren't going to say that you are an ignoramus, the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, or whatever to each other. There's a certain sense in which what they're doing is involves philosophical, metaphysical commitments, interpretive things, and stuff like that. So, how would you describe kind of the state of the God question in informed discourse?
I'd like to take the answer to that question from an angle that you might not be expecting. One of the deepest challenges there is to deal with people who just don't think that there's any depth to the world at all.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do they not think there's a supernatural realm, and they don't think there's a divine being, they also don't think there's any depth to the world that is entitled to be called divine or worshipped or anything, nothing. So this is a kind of loss of poetic sensibility somehow, a loss of depth awareness. It's like someone who can't see in 3 dimensions anymore. I think that's a big challenge. So one of the problems I have when I'm dealing with atheists, challenges, I love the challenge, it's not a problem, is to help them understand their own experience in such a way as to conjure the questions that lead to the God idea. Yeah. I've talked in detail to Dan about this, and he's over dinner and in conference settings. He's actually very open to the idea of the world having depth. He has quite a profound spirituality.
Tell me about it.
He doesn't want to call it religion, and he doesn't want to call it God, but he's totally alert. You can see it in the way he writes. He's totally alert to the depth dimension of life. So is Richard Dawkins, with his fondness for Einsteinian religion, even though he hates the word religion in that phrase. They're both extremely spiritually alert people. So,
but they wouldn't use the word spiritually alert? Is that it?
No, they wouldn't use the word spiritually alert. That's part of the fight. The fight is about what does it take to keep alive that type of awareness so that it's sophisticated and not merely superficial. If you stop talking about it, it gets superficial.
Would you call it the filioque of the Enlightenment? Something like that, where you're like, what an intense debate. Like later in life, like if we get to the point where like socially evolved relationship to religious experience, and you're like, look at this, they're arguing over spirituality,
So I'm not worried about that discourse disappearing exactly, because I think it'll keep being conjured in human experience. What I'm worried about is it becoming undisciplined. The philosophical and theological traditions actually keep that discourse disciplined, even when they take their own images too seriously and need to be challenged by an iconoclastic philosophical mystic, Even when they make those mistakes, they're still keeping the discourse alive and disciplined. And I'm worried that if we take the advice of people like Dan Dennett and Richard Dawkins, what you risk is the loss of precision and the loss of maintenance of an extremely valuable tradition. So I want to fight with the tradition and contest the bits of it that I think are too anthropomorphic, but I don't want to give it up or sacrifice it in the name of we can do everything with science, because we can't do everything with science.
Is that I know, how would you parse that difference? I know some people that are like, well, science doesn't do axiological things, or the humanities are an investigation in and of itself about something other than, right, like the science. Like, how would you kind of describe kind of seeing a more robust understanding of what it is human beings are investigating when we investigate ourselves, the universe, and that kind of thing?
I regularly teach a class called Science Literacy and Scientific Boundary Questions. So we spend a year learning the mathematics that we need to understand modern physics, and we also do the biology. But all along the way, we see where the boundary issues are in science, where science provokes questions that can't be answered on its own terms. Even if it's difficult answering the demarcation problem, which is the name for the question you just asked, what is science and what isn't science? Even if it's difficult to answer that question, it's really obvious in practice when you do science that there are tons of questions that science cannot answer. And if you limit what you're allowed to talk about based on what science can answer and what science can't answer, you chop off a whole bunch of interesting things. Now, which things science can talk about, it changes with time. So it's very difficult to give a kind of neat description of what science can handle and what it can't. But what I'm confident about is that there always will be boundary questions, because there always have been. There still are right now. And there's no sense of them going away whatsoever. They're not declining. They're just shifting around.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of like these conversations in like the picture of kind of social evolution, and then kind of recognize that every kid's born at square one, right? Like Paul, what's his name, wrote the Descartes baby book, Bloom. Is it Bloom?
Paul Bloom.
Yeah, and so like, you know, every baby's a theist. So and I've wondered, and I've been trying to figure out a way of saying this. I think ministers may have this intuition better than others. Like, religious traditions are like spiritual conveyor belts, right? Like every kid is there, and you learn the mythology if your church does anything well, or any religious tradition. They give you big stories to frame the questions of existence. And earlier you have magical type thinking before you have mythological thinking, but the narratives kind of function across from it. And then at some point you ask the question if there really was a fish that swallowed Jonah, and then you find out no, but there's also Ninevehs today, and God insists you love them anyway, right? Like, and you can even take these stories, and there's like a evolution from kind of magical to mythical to kind of a rationalistic understanding to then this kind of postmodern awareness of the understanding of this happening elsewhere and things. But the challenge, I think, is for us to not get off, right? Like at some point on the conveyor belt, but to be at a place where, as a species, knowing every kid is going to involve the same set of DNA, where evolution functions very differently than socially, is we need to develop healthy communities where there are healthy expressions of each stage and opportunities to grow when it's there. But it seems to me that religious congregations tend to have a mass at one level and then demonize all the others, right? Like if you go to the right UCC church, they're Enlightenment thinkers, and they do all their historical Jesus stuff. They make fun of Republicans, probably hate the free market for different reasons than their kind of postmodern UCC friends, who are ardent environmentalists and don't see the value of showing up every week in the same way that institutionalist Enlightenment types do. And they definitely have a value judgment against them. And they probably all have similar value judgments against kind of more tribalistic understandings of religion, and or ones that that your community is held together by ecstatic or supernatural kind of performances and this kind of thing. Is there help for ministers that recognize that most churches actually have people at all those places in it? And what is it like to lead where you're doing what actually helps healthy versions of each flourish? And spiritual formation involves giving the invitation, but not with a sword, to kind of move up the ladder. Because like the two things that blow my mind is like every contemplative hero in any religious tradition tells you there's stages of faith. Like it could be Teresa of Avila does it, Thomas Merton will do it. Like they all these different structures, right, of development. And we are kind of at a point in human history where if we don't figure out a way to bring about healthy expressions of what you could call less developed stages, they're going to have much larger consequences when they start to kill things. And and we aren't going to work together if you only think your place is ideal.
So I want to say two things in response to those interesting thoughts there, Trip. The first is about this, the all children are theists idea, which is the background for thinking about learning. I don't think that's correct, by the way. It's all theists. All children are supernaturalist thinkers who see purpose in things. And we know pretty much now the developmental process where those cognitive things come online. So that's the way we all are. If civilization were to collapse right now, we would wind up with all of those ideas being very strong in every new person. The whatever training or learning we've done to contest those as children grow up would be eventually lost. It would be systematically weakened until it disappears. And we'd have this weird hybrid of sort of high technology, but we don't know what the hell we're doing with it. We don't know how to maintain it. And superstition, supernaturalism, maybe shamanistic type worldviews or local deities or something. That's where we would go. So it shows the power of culture to train children differently. It's not just the preset things we bring to our lives as kids. It's the ability of cultural environments to change people that also matters. So this is now the second point, and it goes to what it's like for a minister who looks out on a congregation and sees a whole diverse group of people, all of whom are being conditioned to think in certain ways using neuroplasticity and the power of culture to help people learn, against a background of preset cognitive emotional tendencies that vary a little bit, but not that much, between human beings. What are they supposed to do with that practically? I think the answer to that, it's worked for me anyway, the answer to that is to notice the different ways that people in the church organize themselves. There's lots of layers, there's lots of corners. There's a time to speak about the cognitive science of religion to religious believers, but it's probably not in the sermon. It's most likely in a Bible study or in a reading group where you read a book together or something like that. And there's a time to be really honest about your deepest thoughts about God, particularly in those pastoral moments when someone's really desperate and they don't just want help, they really want understanding, and they grab you by the scruff of the neck and they ask you, you got to tell me what you think, man, what is really going on there. If you can't be authentic and clear and honest and open with someone at that point, then you're really stuck. Then there are the big public worship events and the outreach events. There's all kinds of things that are going on. So the minister is wise not to try and do everything in one place, but to trust the sort of the social differentiation and complexity of church communities, and then to be ready in each place to try and bring people along whatever learning curve they think is important.
Mm-hmm. Do you how do you respond when someone says, look, why even use the word God for whatever it is you're talking about? Because 90% of the people that use the word God, if they took the time to understand you, are going to go, huh?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. 73% of people use the word God in such a way that they just wouldn't understand the point of me using the word God in the way I do. So
that's very specific. Is that about family gatherings, or did you do a survey?
It's 100 minus 27. Remember I said 27% of people before, according to our estimates. So it's 83% personalist believers in God in the United States, roughly speaking. 73%, about three quarters. So I want to stress that I'm not attached to the word God. It's the depths of things that I care about, and I don't particularly care about the name we use. It's just that in certain traditions, you have to use the names that are available in order to be able to maintain continuity with those wisdom traditions that I was talking about before, without which our language about these things becomes very superficial in a hurry. So in South Asia, I would say Brahman. In China, I would say Tao. Over here, in the Western context, I'm going to say the God beyond God, or I'm going to say ground of being, or the depth structures and dynamic flows of nature or something. But I'm happy to use the word God for that, but I'm not happy to be misunderstood. So I'll constantly be explaining what I mean by it.
How does that kind of like development of understanding of ultimate that individuals go through and communities go through impoverished if we get rid of it, right? Like, it seems to me that there is genuine benefit to belonging to a religious tradition that values kind of development and more creative and critical thought. And there's in the monotheistic faiths, there's always been a kind of relationship between God, the natural order, science, that it's at least been embraced in a number of the traditions, that if we got to a point where you are like, we don't need to really use the word God in the West, what are we cutting ourselves off from? Because I mean, in Los Angeles, worked at a very progressive church. Like, you saw parents panic and then bring their kids to church, even though they were not going to use the word God, realizing that they would say things like, I'm not really sure about God per se, or I had this experience, I don't really like the church or whatnot. But I would have never got there if I hadn't been a part of the church, or like, it's only because of having the place to wrestle with these stories and questions that you get to a place of having a more sophisticated understanding of the depth, a dimension. Is there a, culturally, do you see like an impoverishment if we cut ourselves off from the wisdom traditions that is a pragmatic argument for preserving God language?
I do see an impoverishment, yeah, but I also see opportunities for change. I mean, the new 2030 goals that follow on the Millennium Goals, which have reduced crushing poverty by a surprisingly large percent, surprisingly quickly. Those new goals, that's all been driven by humanists, not the church, and not other religions. Religions have been impediments to solving the problem of crushing poverty around the world, and the problem of justice for women, and the problem of sexual violence and a bunch of other things. No, in some ways, we'd definitely be better off without churches and synagogues and, traditions of religion, no question about it. But the churches have also been revolutionary in things like civil rights. The churches have been incredibly important for establishing hospitals and caring for the poor, and they've been extremely important in cultivating the moral characteristics that civilizations need in order to be able to solve, and according to Max Weber, also for grounding things like modern capitalistic forms of economic practice. So it's a totally ambiguous situation. What I do think is pretty clear is that if you stop talking about something, you lose refined understanding of it, and your experiences of the depths of the world of God or whatever, they become more inarticulate, they become more chaotic, and they become less able to guide people, less able to help people make sense of their lives, less able to construct meaning for their lives. And the puzzle is, how do you maintain a serious discussion about the words that we use in churches and synagogues and whatnot, at the same time as pushing back against the tribalistic weakness of religious traditions, where they've proved to be so inert in relation to some really large social problems. And I think you do that by continuing to try and not giving up. I mean, it's a long process.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm interested in is kind of how you see in LeRon's book on the birth of God. He also talks about like bearing God, or like what's it like to carry God, with us. And I like in it. I mean, he's arguing that there's a trajectory, be it through kind of critical thinking or critical theological thinking, or even the mystical pursuit or whatever, where these kind of trajectories that are in wisdom traditions, there's a breakthrough point where you're like freed from God. And I wonder how you would, because we haven't talked a whole lot about it, describe, we've talked about the religious side, I guess the thematized side of religion, but how would you talk about the spiritual or mystical questions, those intense religious experiences and their relationship to ultimate reality or the plausibility of one?
Yeah, it's complicated. I've written a lot on this and studied it for a long time. Our experiences are they're very subjective, but they're at the same time extremely important to us. They're very hard to evaluate in terms of their plausibility or their evidential properties. Like, do they support my belief in God? If I have an experience that God forgives me and loves me, does that make my belief in God stronger? And the answer is really hard to make out. Philosophically, it's hard to make out. I'm sure of it. So what that means is you really are in a very complex territory philosophically. That's part of the problem in the debate that you see between Philip and LeRon. It's a complex debate, and they're trying to get it all out in sound bites, and it's very difficult to evaluate the evidence. Now, the difference between LeRon and me on this is that I want to maintain continuity with wisdom traditions, whereas he seems really confident that we'd just be better off dumping them, or if not dumping them, so revolutionizing them that you've got these major discontinuities introduced. And I'm not sure where he comes by his confidence. I think maybe that's one thing about LeRon that hasn't changed. He's always been extremely confident. And he's as confident now, I think, as he was before when he was writing more in a more conservative evangelical vein. Philip's way of thinking is more akin to mine in terms of being able to see pro and con evidence all at the same time and trying to weigh it. We come out on different sides of that issue, obviously, but both of us see the full range of evidence, I think, and both of us have mixed feelings about it. And so I relate sort of more strongly to the mode of inquiry and the sense for weighing evidence that Philip uses. When you put these two people together, it makes for a spectacular conflict, in part because of this difference. One person's so confident and making a case that these traditions pass these thresholds and then they disintegrate. We can really do that, and that's what we should do. And the other person's saying, hold on a second, this is a very complicated evidential situation. The philosophical considerations are also very confident. Don't we need to slow down here and think about things more patiently? And I'm on Phil's side in that debate, but I'm very friendly with LeRon and agree with his sense that there are certain thresholds that we would do well to pass. And one of them for me is supernaturalism. If we could leave behind supernaturalism, I think we would be more accurate in our way of engaging God than we are at the moment, if we could do it. I think it's very complicated, and I described before the conditions under which that could happen. But, I do agree that he's right about that. That's why he calls himself an atheist. He really means post-supernaturalist. And if I win my arguments with him, he's going to keep calling himself, he's going to keep using the word God. He'll just use it for something different. It won't have a supernaturalist connotation anymore, but he'll still use the word. I haven't won those arguments with him yet, but I'm still trying.
Mm-hmm. So maybe with some of the kind of pushbacks with the way Phil frames things, because he talks about kind of spectrum, right, of plausibility. And in predicament of belief, I remember joking with him just because Phil is one of the most inclusive advisors, so he has advisees that, are like writing dissertations on Judith Butler and post-structuralists and things that you, if you just had read Phil and never met him, are like, well, that's interesting. Like, where'd that person come from? As your advisee. And we're in the advisee gathering discussing the book, and I was like, Phil, I didn't know if you were still allowed to talk after all the way on page 56 is where you decide you have ended stating things that are, the top or next to top level of confidence or plausibility scale metaphysically. That either is offensive to the rest of the people who are really into rational scientific thinking, that you are going to keep talking about God being self-thematized in the person of Jesus, or post-structurals here, they're going to be upset. You had 56 pages of just hating all that we have gained in the last 40 years of. Yeah,
let him be upset. Let them all be upset. Phil's dead right about this. You see it in the way the brain works. We really do have plausibility evaluation systems. That's the way we work. It's like pattern recognition. We see entire faces. We don't analyze faces, first the eyes, then the nostrils, then the mouth and whatnot. We don't do it that way. We see a whole face. That's how we evaluate evidence. So you wind up with a comparative judgment all the time when you make judgments. Now, sometimes you need to assent to something. Like Phil, having seen the evidence and judged it sort of, I think, in a 70-30 way, says it's 70% probable that God is at least minimally intentional, agential, and aware of what's going on with things.
And no less than personal.
And, of course, no less than personal. That's implied in those statements.
Yeah.
So the fact that he says that is experienced as a challenge to people who think that you're supposed to count something as knowledge only when it's completely certain. No, there's a difference between being certain and assenting to something. First, evaluate evidence, evaluate plausibility comparatively, and then assent to something if you want. And hopefully, if you're rational, you'll assent to the thing that's most probable. You can actually say yes to something even when you know there's a 30% chance you're wrong. But he's right. That's closer to how we work. It's a more secure, intellectually and emotionally secure way of conducting inquiry. I've spent a long time defending this type of inquiry, and I follow the same patterns and practices. It's fundamentally fallibilist. It's fundamentally comparative. It's fundamentally cross-cultural, and it's fundamentally transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And he follows that same recipe as I do. So though we judge the 70-30 evidence situation oppositely, we're thinking exactly the same way about how to think about evidence.
Mm-hmm. So maybe for you, I'm interested not so much in them, but how would you describe kind of your journey academically in the way you look back at those more particular parts of the Christian tradition, be it things like Christology, Trinity, atonement, these type of doctrines that kind of assume God, but they assume different images of God depending on different understandings of the incarnation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we're specifically back in Christianity again now. What I discovered when I was a late teenager and started to think about these things was that I had all kinds of questions that I wasn't able to get answers to. I didn't know there was philosophy and theology, as I said before, but in my mid-20s I discovered that there was. So I started to learn that there were these long, complicated traditions. So my views about these things have been the same for a long time. I just got better at explaining them, better at talking about them, clearer in my mind about how to say it. So on Christology, for example, I really haven't changed my views since I was 19, but I just learned to develop things like distinctions, like types of Christology, and to locate where I am by contrast with other types. So, for example, I'm on the modest type of Christology versus the absolutist type of Christology. And I didn't have that distinction at one time, and then I did, so I started using it, but I've always held the view. So, in fact, my spirituality has been remarkably steady. It strikes me over the course of my life anyway, steady. My theological opinion, steady. But I've become clearer and clearer. On prayer, I gave you a very clear answer to the prayer question I thought before. A modest Christology is one that rejects the absolutist principle that says that Jesus, the Christ, is definitive once for all and sort of absolutely crucial for salvation, liberation, and relationship to God. I reject that. I just think it's wrong, but I still think Jesus is important, and as a Christian, I still follow Jesus. So there's this embrace of Jesus, this following him like the way he called the disciples, like Philip and Nathaniel and all the rest. I'm one of them. I feel called by him through the scriptures and the church tradition, and I follow him. But I don't think he's divine because I don't think that means anything. To say a human being is divine the way the incarnation does, I think is mythological. I don't think it's coherent. Paul Tillich said exactly the same thing. So I'm definitely in a particular strand of theological tradition, but it's not because I've changed my mind. Right.
So how would you describe then, like Paul Tillich says stuff like, but there had to be like the event of new being. So for someone that is hearing that and going, oh, well, he's just, this just sounds like he's getting rid of it. But how does the event itself that draws disciples, the Christian community together, worship, pray, communion, that kind of stuff, how do you understand it from this ground of being, understanding of God, this more sophisticated understanding of prayer, religious experience, and things?
Yeah, Tillich, of course, changed his mind on that question from the first volume to the last volume of his systematic theology, and went to his death full of regret that he wasn't able to clarify the whole system in light of his later understanding. His later understanding was more spirit-centered, whereas his earlier understanding was more Christocentric. The spirit-centered view at the end understands the spirit working through the world in all kinds of different ways through spiritual communities, and he sees the Christ event, where Jesus is recognized as the Christ, as being one of those crucial moments where one of those spiritual communities comes to life and then influences people down the centuries. That's exactly how I think it happens. As for whether Jesus needs to create a sacrificial atonement to make God willing to forgive us, I never understood that. I mean, I've studied it. I understand it really deeply from a technical point of view, but spiritually, as a father, I forgive my children when they make mistakes, and the only reason God can't, apparently, is because God won't. God could, but God doesn't in this story. Now, it's said that God is super holy and can't forgive, but holiness can't confine the divine glory or the divine power. So I would say this was a holdover from another view, and like Tillich, we do well to think about accepting acceptance rather than thinking of a sacrificial atonement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I've in just trying to describe that in ways that I don't know, people with with their religious experiences tied to Christ versus God, I find that, or the Spirit becomes like, seems like there different parts of the church have particular persons, I guess, of the Trinity they're more related to. They're very theocentric Christians, Christocentric ones, and ones that the presence and activity of the Spirit becomes the dominant form. In trying to differentiate, or taking Tillich's insight to kind of talk about within the church, the Christ event is in some sense the way we come to understand the form of those type of experiences, but like in affirmation of the Spirit is a recognition that God can take up, in a sense, any of conditioned existence. The unconditioned can break through. And the fact that God did it with a homeless dead Jew and came to the nobodies and the left behind and said, you are accepted regardless of what the religious, cultural, and political system said, it is evidence of the radical nature of the event, not a reason to close it off.
Yeah, totally. And the Christ event doesn't belong to Christians. I think that's just a terrible mistake the church makes. It sequesters Jesus, makes Jesus theirs. The Christ event is something that happened for everyone. The same thing's true for the Buddha. This happened in the world. Mm-hmm. It's everyone's property. You can't control it, church. And this is what the Pentecostals are so strong on. They've got a way of saying that non-spirit-centered people have difficulty with. So one of the things I've been noticing in Pentecostal Christianity in the last few years is the rise of people who are quite radical in their theological outlook, who are quite iconoclastic, who are quite anti-anthropomorphic. And as they develop their theology, they're relying on categories that come from thinking about God's Spirit moving in the world in ways that we can't understand or predict. They use that to liberate Christian doctrine from tired, moribund adherence to doctrines that have really outlived their usefulness. The doctrines themselves, they can be reframed, they can be kept. So you keep Christology, just interpret it differently. And it's a long, long heritage of alternative interpretations from a sacrificial atonement. There are lots of alternatives, even in the scriptures.
There's even cooler ones that are older than sacrificial atonement. What I was editing a book on the Holy Spirit for the series. It's really the podcast, and it's in each chapter, so like connecting either like a historic or biblical image of the Spirit with a different image of the Spirit in Eastern religious traditions, and then playing them off each other and kind of mutually transforming them and expanding them. And I found it to be like a one of those for a you read your Bible and pray every day in Jesus' name. Baptist preacher's kid. It's like every day you're every little bit of your kind of desire to hold your tradition and the way it was handed to you just pops up. in reading it, and it provokes you to become more aware of stuff you never would have thought is like in you, unless it's like right there in your face and you're actually having to make comments about it. And I think that is helpful because one of the things that kind of science about religion shows us is that there's no need to pretend we're like blank slate, rational, equally assessing, open-minded people. Like, when it comes to being human, you're not. And religion, you're probably even worse than that. But like, when Paul's like, you're a slave to sin, it's kind of helpful to know that you married someone who's also a slave to sin, because then you're very aware that you're mutually kind of assholes. Like that jumps out, and it's not necessarily like you're being free and rational and I'm deciding to say the most hateful thing I can say right now. No, there's like other stuff working in you than your free, loving, rational will. And recognize that religion has all those things in it, and it could be operating in you unreflectively. I think calls us to a different type of generosity in relating to the religious other, even in our own traditions.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you for saying it. I like that.
Well, so if last question is, what question or two would you ask directly to one of to LeRon or Phil or something you think that would be helpful? Like, when they answer it, everyone will see just kind of the distinctions between the two.
Oh, that's a good question. I want to know the conditions under which LeRon would accept the continued use of God language to describe whatever it is that's in the depths of things. I know he's sensitive to the depths of things, very sensitive, but what are the conditions under which God language would be legitimate there? And maybe he's going to say it's just too damn confusing. Every time people use the word God, they think of a supernatural being. We have to stop using the word for a century. Maybe come back to it after that. Maybe. But whatever he says, I want to know the answer to that question. And for Philip, I want to know, I still do not understand why he judges the plausibility of the relative, the competing options in that 70-30 way that he does. That's my numbers, not his. But I still don't understand why he comes out. When he's fighting with LeRon, you never get to that question, because, of course, what he's trying to do is to say that you can accept everything LeRon is saying with regard to the science and resist his interpretation of it, which is, he's going to win that fight. Philip's going to win that fight every day. I want him to tell me, I've read the book, so I know the answer at a certain level. I just don't get it. Why he comes down on the side of God as having minimal intentionality, awareness, and agency. I can see that he needs that to maintain the particular version of the Christian gospel that he appreciates, and I agree with him that you do need that to maintain that particular version of the Christian gospel. But I don't know. I even after reading the arguments in the books, I still can't see how he comes down on that. So I don't know. It's a question in my mind I've never been able to get answered.
Well, I would just say that if you're one of his students, he's really good at not answering questions in class. So he wants it just to be about the text you're reading, and not his own. So I feel like somewhere after I pay off my student loans is when I'll get the direct answer. But
yeah, good.
But if you can't get it in a room at AAR, then then I think we'll see. I'll write out your question and read it dramatically, and I'll let LeRon decide if he answered it. And
make sure Philip gets to decide whether LeRon answered the question about the conditions under which God language can be preserved.
I think it'd be fun, and I think there'll definitely be people who have heard each one individually on the podcast and are excited about it. Be a lot more prepared to connect dots when you're hearing them talk or debacle, because you hung out with us on the internet today. So thank you tons for doing it.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Glad to be with you, mate. Appreciate it.
Well, hopefully next time we can talk about spiritual technologies, because I didn't know that you were inventing prayer apps for your iPhone, but I had found out that that this is what you're working on.
Not prayer apps for iPhones, but yeah, other technologies for enhancing religious experience. I'm quite interested in helping people make sense of them, evaluate them, because they are here and are coming fast.
Mm-hmm. So I was joking about the iPhone app for prayer, but
I realize, yeah.
I
wasn't sure your listeners realized.
I told LeRon when he was talking about the kind of modeling project associated with a grant. I was like, well, he was talking about it. I was like, well, once you get around to having the iPad app like iGods, where you're like inserting what the climate is at a different part of the world with a certain diversity among human beings, what percent Neanderthal. Like, I was like, you could have all the variables and do it, and then you kind of watch how religion plays out.
I've already thought that one through. It's called SimGod.
SimGod. Here's the thing: is like when you put it out, there'll be like a whole bunch of interesting media for it. So I mean, for sheer publicity purposes, when you have something you want someone to know, having an iPad app called SimGods will be great. You can even put the S in parentheses, where it's like it starts out where there's multiple deities, and maybe you evolve to the one true God, and you're like, you have to wait until update 7 before you find out if Trinitarian theism is where all evolutionary trajectories of God go. And but all the right people would get so upset that you would get publicity, and everyone would want to. And you do it where, like, to download the app, they're like, oh, it's $1.99, but it all goes to science education. And so it's like everything you could do that would irritate the right people. And like if they start picking really super conservative answers and stuff for it, it's like, in 2,000 years, you will have a Noah and the Ark museum funded by the state. and stuff like that.
Oh, well, that's wild. I'll take all of that under advisement. Thank you for the suggestions.
Oh, no. Well, there's plenty more free, really good advice for you. When it goes to studying the biocultural evolution of religion, as a handheld device games, I'm going to try to corner that market.
All right, man. Great talking to you, Dave. Thank you.
All righty. I hope you have a great afternoon.